I'm Yong Lee, the Deputy Director of the Korea Program at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Today we celebrate journalism. Journalism that stays true to the heart, become voices of the unheard, and sheds light on the truth. With this spirit, the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center has been presenting the Shorenstein Journalism Award to distinguished journalists since 2002. And this year, I am honored and delighted to announce that Anna Fifield, the Beijing Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, is the recipient of the 17th Shorenstein Journalism Award. To celebrate this occasion, Ms. Fifield will deliver a keynote address on how North Korea is and isn't changing under Kim Jong-un. Furthermore, we have invited two distinguished guests. Barbara Demick, the New York correspondent of the LA Times, and Andrei Abraminian, the Koret Fellow at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, as panelists. Before introducing Anna Fifield and turning the mic to her, I'd like to say a few words about Walter Shorenstein and the Shorenstein Journalism Award. The Shorenstein Journalism Award was established in 2002 by the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, APARC, at Stanford University, in partnership with the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard. It is named after Mr. Walter H. Shorenstein, a visionary businessman, philanthropist, a champion of Asian American relations, who was dedicated to promoting excellence in journalism and a deeper understanding of Asia. He had a passion for Asia, and in particular, the intersection of media and politics. The original purpose of the award was to honor outstanding American and US-based journalists who spent their careers helping Americans understand Asia. After Walter Shorenstein passed away in 2010, Stanford became the sole sponsor of the award. Shorenstein APARC decided to broaden the scope of the award to include Asian journalists who, in addition to their professional excellence and contribution to knowledge of Asia, have helped to defend and build a free media in Asia. In addition to individuals, organizations would also be eligible for the award. Under these terms, beginning in 2011, the award has been given to Kaikshin Media, Barbara Demick, Aung Zal, Jacob Schlesinger, Yoichi Funabashi, Ian Johnson, and Siddharth Varadarajan. We have been honored to be able to present the Journalism Award every year. And in the face of current attacks on journalists and the truth in the US and the world, we are even more committed to excellence in journalism and to defending independent and free media. Now, back to today's distinguished journalists. Anna Fifield is the Beijing Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, responsible for coverage of Greater China. She joined the Washington Post in July 2014 as Tokyo Bureau Chief, writing about Japan and the two Koreas for 4 years, with a concentration on North Korea. She has been on 12 reporting trips to North Korea and regularly talks about North Korea on international television and radio and at conferences. Before joining the Washington Post, Fifield was a fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University, where she studied how change happens in closed societies. Previously, she was a correspondent for the Financial Times for 13 years, based in London, Sydney, Seoul, Tehran, Beirut, and finally in Washington, D.C., where she was White House correspondent and covered the 2012 president election campaign. However, after 4 years in DC, her desire to talk to real people, that is, dust on boots reporting, and her desire to get back out in the world prompted her to become a foreign correspondent again. And now she's back in Asia, in Northeast Asia, to cover today's extremely exciting and important times. Fifield comes from New Zealand and has a BA in English Literature from Victoria University and a postgraduate diploma in journalism from Canterbury University. Please join me in welcoming Anna Fifield.
Thank Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for your very kind introduction. And thank you to Stanford University and the Shorenstein Center for giving me this award. It's my great honor. And especially also for inviting Barbara Demick and Andre Abrahamian along, two people who I've learned so much from throughout my career in coverage of North Korea. So I learned a very long time ago to never predict anything about North Korea. Even the great Don Oberdorfer, the 2004 winner of this award and a previous Washington Post correspondent in Asia, wrote in the preface to his seminal book, The Two Koreas, "Despite all efforts, I continue to be impressed with what I do not know, especially about North Korea." Some 4 decades ago, the CIA gave North Korea 5 years max. 2 decades ago, Don Oberdorfer concluded that North Korea could not continue to exist in the long term. And 1 decade ago, as I was wrapping up my first stint covering the Koreas, that time for the Financial Times, I just could not envisage any way in which this regime could survive the death of the second-generation leader and the unprecedented transition to a third-generation leader. Kim Il-sung had created this myth of revolutionary heroism around himself, and then he'd created this myth of divine selection around his son, Kim Jong-il. How could the North Korean people, who no longer live in a hermit kingdom, tolerate a third leader called Kim, let alone one who had no highly exaggerated or just plain fictional backstory? Well, here we are. Next month, Kim Jong-un will celebrate his 7th anniversary as the leader of North Korea. I continue to be impressed with what I do not know about North Korea. But when I returned in 2014 for my second stint of covering the two Koreas with a focus on North Korea 4 years ago, I really wanted to try and figure out how Kim Jong-un had done it. How had this podgy young upstart with no qualifications other than being born into this family managed to take control of this regime of men in their 70s and 80s, of this country of 25 million individuals? How had he managed to keep intact this anachronistic system that should have died years, even decades before? So there are many factors at play here. For one, Kim Jong-un is a leader who has proven to be much bolder and far more audacious than his father ever was. His father spoke in public only once during the course of his 17 years in power, and even then it was only one single sentence that he said. Whereas Kim Jong-un seems to be out there and talking all the time. And as proof of, this boldness, just look at this year's charm offensive. The sight of Kim Jong-un hopping off an Air China plane in Singapore would have been unimaginable even a year ago. He has also been brutal. He has clamped down on the borders to make it harder for ordinary people to escape. The number of escapees from North Korea has plummeted under his leadership. He apparently had his defense minister reduced to a pulp with an anti-aircraft gun, apparently because the man fell asleep at a meeting when Kim Jong-un was talking. He ruthlessly dispatched with both his uncle and his half-brother. So he's given people at all levels of society in North Korea reason to be scared. But Kim Jong-un has also given them reason to be proud. It wasn't too long ago that serious experts were poo-pooing the idea that North Korea could ever build a hydrogen bomb or an intercontinental ballistic missile. Well, guess what? They have now done both. Last year, between missile launches and nuclear tests, I talked to a guy who was a science student at Sariwon in North Korea at the time that Kim Jong-un took over the leadership. And he was somebody who absolutely detested the regime. It was him who told me for a piece last year that the worst thing about North Korea was being born there. But even he was proud of North Korea's nuclear program, especially as a science student. And he was especially proud of the fact that North Korea, backwards North Korea, had managed to do something that South Korea and Japan had not. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that domestic propaganda value in that program there. But the single biggest reason for North Korea, for Kim Jong-un's success so far, And the single biggest change in North Korea since its inception 70 years ago has been the emergence of this dynamic market economy. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the changes I've seen and heard about since I started covering North Korea in 2004. And also how I think that these changes are influencing Kim Jong-un's actions and decisions today, including his rationale for meeting Donald Trump. But before I go on, let me just say that all of these changes I'm going to describe are within a North Korean context. I am not in any way saying that life in North Korea is good. It is definitely not. It has gone for many people from being abjectly horrible to slightly less abjectly horrible. But the things I'm going to talk about are a description of trajectory, rather than an absolute level. And also, please don't mistake my comments for admiration for Kim Jong-un. They are definitely not that either. He is a tyrant, but he is a smart tyrant who's been operating in a very calculating way since he took over. And to treat him as if he's some joke or some madman is to underestimate the threat of him. So for 70 years, North Korea had steadfastly stuck to its centrally planned communist model. Even through China's reform and opening, through the Soviet Union's perestroika, and then through the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then, as Barbara Demick described in Nothing to Envy, the best book ever written about North Korea, the North Korean regime had no choice but to allow market activity during the famine of the 1990s. The state ration system had completely collapsed, and it was a case of either tolerate a little more buying and selling of food, a little more market activity, or risk the implosion of the North Korean system. But it was grudging. The regime did the bare minimum, allowed the bare minimum at the time, and was really just legitimizing or retroactively legalizing changes that had already happened and been driven from the bottom up. Fast forward 20 years, and now that famine generation has grown up with the markets. They are native capitalists. Markets are now the foundation of daily life across North Korea. There are more than 400 established state-sanctioned markets in North Korea, the Jangmadang. That's more than double the number that existed when Kim Jong-un took over at the end of 2011. And thanks to satellite photos, we can see these markets popping up across the country. There are now markets in every town and city in North Korea. And we can also see them moving to bigger buildings as they expand or need upgraded facilities. Surveys from people who have escaped from North Korea suggest that more than half of the people now earn their living from the markets. And some 85% of people say that they get their food through the markets. That is an enormous change in North Korea. These markets are no longer just tolerated by the system, but they're actually promoted and encouraged by the system. This is partly because the state makes a lot of money out of the markets now. The merchants rent their stalls and they pay taxes in this supposedly communist society. And they also give plenty of kickbacks to officials on the take. So right down through the system, everybody has an incentive to allow these markets to work. These markets are now simultaneously the biggest help to Kim Jong-un as he tries to stay in power, but also the biggest risk to his leadership. So let me explain. Kim Jong-un has not allowed these markets to flourish because he cares about the people and their well-being. He's demonstrated time and time again that he definitely does not care at all about the people. There's only one thing that Kim Jong-un cares about, and that is staying in power. Kim Jong-il, his father, he was 53 years old when he took over the leadership of North Korea. So really he knew that all he had to do was hang in there. Couple of decades, he could make it. He lasted 17. Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, he was 27 years old when he took over the running of North Korea. He couldn't just hang in there. He could feasibly, imagine ruling for 30 or 40 or even 50 years in the future. So he did not have the option of just hanging in there if he wanted to rule for the rest of his life and die a natural death in his bed. So 4 months into his tenure in 2012, Kim Jong-un declared in his first public speech that North Koreans would never have to tighten their belts again. Of course, there was a great deal of skepticism that he would be able to make good on this. But just by letting markets operate and allowing people to make their own money, he has unleashed all of this pent-up entrepreneurialism. Many people have worked their way to a better standard of living that Kim Jong-un has promised them. And of course, the brilliant comrade takes all of the credit for this. He's allowed life to get better for the average North Korean, a little bit better. And he's allowed it to get a lot better for the elites who keep him in power. Last year, I spent a lot of time talking to North Koreans who'd escaped since 2013 so that I could write about life under Kim III. I talked to more than 25 people who had lived under the third generation leader of North Korea. But as I talked to these escapees, time and time again, they described to me how they got nothing from the state and everything from the markets. One young woman I met from Chongqing, she was the daughter of a master of money. She described to me how in the markets she'd bought rollerblades at a cost of $30, which at the time was the equivalent of 30 kilos of rice, and French perfume and a cap with a Nike swoosh on it, all from the markets. Tight pants, high heels, makeup. She could buy it all in the markets. And if a guy was showing interest in her at this ping pong hall, she would first check out his phone. If he had an old-fashioned flip phone, he didn't stand a chance. But if he had an Arirang smartphone, a North Korean version of a Chinese Android phone, then maybe she'd talk to him. This was the life of a rich kid in North Korea these days, especially in Pyongyang, the capital within a capital where the elite live. They go to the gym so they can wear skimpy exercise gear in front of each other. They ask their friends who can travel to bring back clothes from H&M and Zara. In Pyongyang these days, you can even get your eyelids done for between $50 and $200, depending on the skill of the surgeon. These elite millennials, many of whom are the same age as Kim Jong-un, could potentially support his leadership for decades to come, and he's made a concerted effort to coddle them. And for many of them, it's better to be a part of this brat pack in North Korea, despite all of the restrictions on their freedom of speech and movement, than it is to be an ordinary person struggling to make headway in the South Korean rat race. The woman from Chongqing complained to me that her apartment in Seoul was so much smaller than her house in North Korea, like a cheap motel room, she said to me. But at the other end of the spectrum, I interviewed a woman and her daughter from Haeryong on the border with China. With the state providing nothing anymore, and the husband and father of this family having taken off for South Korea, these people had no choice but to try and earn for themselves. The mother took her daughter out of school as soon as she finished elementary, and they raised pigs and made tofu. They trekked into the mountains before dawn to tend to crops of corn. It was a back-breaking existence. If they were lucky, they made enough money each day to buy their food. If they were not, they were happy to break even, better than losing everything. And they became involved in private enterprise out of necessity, not out of entrepreneurial zeal. All the while, the girl who was 12 would sit in the window of their house, selling tofu and watching her old friends heading home from school for lunch. As I listened to the stories of these people who had escaped, it struck me how little involvement in their daily lives the state had. Yes, they still have to go to their weekly ideological lectures and self-criticism sessions. They have to go out on the streets at dawn and sweep if their neighborhood leader tells them to. But they now have more agency than at any time before in their lives. There was the drug dealer I met who supplied the local chief police with crystal meth so he could keep running his business. The young guy who used his grandfather's good political connections to get the permits he needed to operate an intercity logistics business. He leased a truck from a state company, supposedly state company, with money that his mother had sent him from China. There was the young mother I met who sent 100 renminbi notes to school to her daughter's kindergarten teacher to ensure that she got good treatment while she was at kindergarten. When it comes to money, when it comes to the economy, there are very few problems today that money cannot solve. But when it comes to politics, well, that's a whole different story. The scholar Andrei Lankov likes to say that this isn't reform and opening like Deng Xiaoping brought into China. He says this is reform without opening. There has been no loosening in the political arena in North Korea. In fact, quite the opposite. Every single North Korean that I talked to last year had watched foreign films, rom-coms and action movies and X-rated stuff, and they all knew that what the regime was telling them about the outside world being a morally inferior, backwards place, well, that was all lies. But the punishment in North Korea is still so severe that no one can voice any criticism or any doubt about the regime, and definitely not any doubt about the leader. No one can say that this emperor has no clothes, at least not without risking being sent, along with 3 generations of their family, to a lifetime of hard labor in the concentration camps in the mountains. Even today, there is no newspaper or TV channel in North Korea that doesn't laud the terrific feats of the brilliant comrade. There is no known dissident in North Korea. There is no Liu Xiaobo. There is not even any graffiti. For now, Kim Jong-un has managed to keep a hold of the system by operating a reign of terror, by using fear to keep people from agitating for change. As one former North Korean told me last year, if you disagree with the system, you try to leave. You don't try to change it. But this is where the markets become a real risk for Kim Jong-un. By allowing this private economy to flourish, the regime has lost one of its key levers of control over the populace. North Koreans don't, by and large, rely on the regime for any of their daily needs anymore. And that gives the regime less power and less leverage over them on a daily basis. Plus, as Kim Jong-un must have learned during his classes on the French Revolution while he was at school in Switzerland, there is the risk of rising expectations. Many North Koreans have enjoyed a small improvement in their lives, and they want it to continue. What happens when those rising expectations go unmet? When Kim Jong-un can't unleash tangible progress just by unshackling people from economic constraints. Before, everyone in North Korea was pretty much equally poor. Now there are real, visible economic disparities inside North Korea. It's especially pronounced between Pyongyang and the countryside, but it exists within cities and even within Pyongyang itself. It's very hard to believe in the socialist paradise when some people can spend 2 or 3 months the average wage on dinner in the German beer hall in the middle of Pyongyang. So for now, Kim Jong-un is relying on the old tried and true North Korean method of repression and brutality to keep the people in check. But one of the biggest risks I've noticed in my recent reporting is that increasingly people are not fleeing North Korea for economic reasons. They're no longer fleeing because they're starving. They're fleeing because they're disillusioned. Maybe half of the North Koreans that I interviewed last year described feeling in different ways that they had no hope in North Korea. There was one young woman I met who she'd been so committed to the system that she wanted to grow up to be the mayor of her town. She wanted to be a party leader. And then she realized that her family had bad political standing because one distant relative had escaped to South Korea. And she realized that would prevent her from ever achieving her regimes in the North Korean system. And she gave up all hope. There was also a family that I met in Thailand. It was only 12 days after they had escaped from North Korea. They were on their way out at the time. And they decided to leave because of schooling. It's the very same reason that thousands of South Korean families move to the United States every year, to give their children a better chance at education. They had enjoyed a relatively good life in North Korea because the man worked on the border in a state job, and he was able to run a flourishing smuggling business on the side. But their son, he was very gifted at art, and their rural high school had no art program. And anyway, the teachers hardly ever showed up because they were too busy making money in the markets. So this family decided to flee. I met them again in South Korea the very week that the son was starting high school there, and he was very excited to be going, even though, I mean, their life was very difficult in South Korea and much more expensive, I think, than they realized. So to sustain any pretense that he is the best leader for North Korea, because look, everything's getting so much better, Kim Jong-un is going to need to do so much more than to tolerate the markets. He's going to have to continue to show sustained progress. And I think that's where Donald Trump and Moon Jae-in come into the equation, because Kim Jong-un desperately needs inward investment, which South Korea can provide, and sanctions relief, which they hope to get from the United States. And it's for that reason that I feel uncharacteristically optimistic about the diplomatic process that is happening this year. I do not for 1 second think that Kim Jong-un is going to give up his nuclear program, but I think he may be willing to go some way down the path towards better relations. Maybe he'll give up a few warheads or a few ICBMs, and that in itself would be welcome news, but it's nothing that would be irreversible. I think that Kim Jong-un wants to become a developmental dictator along the lines of Park Chung-hee or Lee Kuan Yew. So despite the ups and downs, I think there could be some progress to be made between the US and North Korea. Trump may be an unconventional American president, but Kim Jong-un is a relatively unconventional North Korean leader too, and he needs this process. And maybe as part of this, there is a chance for us in the outside world to see this as an opportunity not just to reduce the threat of North Korea and Kim Jong-un to us on the outside, but also to help reduce the threat of the North Korean regime to the people on the inside. Thank you very much for listening to that. I now look forward to having a discussion with you.
As well. Now, I'd like to ask our two panelists to give their own brief remarks, and after which we'll have an open discussion. So I'll briefly introduce our panelists. Barbara Demick is the New York correspondent of the Los Angeles Times. She was formerly head of the bureaus in Beijing and Seoul. She is the author of many books, Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, and Logavina Street, Life and Death in Sarajevo Neighborhood. Demick has won Britain's Samuel Johnson Award for Best Nonfiction, the George Polk Award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Award, as well as the Osborne Elliott Prize for Journalism from the Asia Society and the Overseas Press Club, the American Academy of Diplomacy's Arthur Ross Award, and Stanford University's Shorenstein Journalism Award for Best Asia Reporting. That's a lot of awards.
The most important.
She has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. She was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations as well. Andrei Abrahamian is a 2018-19 Court Fellow in the Korea program at Stanford's Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. He has been the Executive Director and Director of Research for Chosun Exchange, a nonprofit that has trained over 2,000 North Koreans in entrepreneurship and economic policy since 2010. His work for Chosun Exchange and other projects has taken him to North Korea 30 times. That's a lot of times. He has also lived in Myanmar, where he conducted field research for his recent book, North Korea and Myanmar, Divergent Paths, which asks why Myanmar came to end its isolation, while North Korea has not done so yet. Abrahamian is an honorary fellow at Macquarie University in Sydney, and an adjunct fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute. He's a frequent contributor to 38 North, a website focused on North Korea analysis, and is a member of the U.S. National Committee on North Korea. He holds a PhD from the University of Ulsan and an MA from the University of Sussex in International Relations. So I'd like to first invite Barbara Demick to give her remarks. You can give it here, or if you want.
Maybe stay here. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me again. Thank you to the Shorenstein family and to Stanford University for this repeat visit, and to Anna Fifield for securing my invitation. I'm really excited that this award is going again to Korea coverage. I mean, I think it started with Donna Oberdorfer in 2004, then me, and now Anna, who is really at the helm of the new generation of North Korea correspondents. I mean, she has, I think, broken most of the stories about North Korea for the last decade, and is, really owns this story in the way that nobody else has. And I'm thrilled to be here with her. I met Anna in 2004 when she was the Financial Times correspondent in Seoul, and I was with the Los Angeles Times, and I think we had lunch, probably Twinjan Chige, in a little cafe, and she asked me to help her explain to the waitress that she didn't eat meat or fish, which I did in very poor Korean. And then I think within a couple of weeks, her Korean was much better than mine, to my great annoyance. And she was also traveling in and out of North Korea, which was, I think, aided by having a passport from New Zealand instead of the United States. But it wasn't, merely language skills or the right passport. I mean, she was just, smart and dogged and could write, and like many of us, became obsessed with North Korea, these places that are mysterious, that you can't get all the answers from Google or Google Earth, are very alluring to foreign correspondents. We like challenges, but there's a lot there, and covering North Korea is like no place else in the world. I've covered a few so-called repressive regimes. I was in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and you would give your minder, a couple of dollars to buy a cup of coffee, and he'd disappear for the next 6 hours. And in Iran, I'd wear a hijab. I'm sure you did too. And in Western China, in the Uyghur and Tibetan areas, I have a big floppy hat and a pollution mask, and that helps a lot. But North Korea isn't like that at all. And, you always have, one minder to watch the other minder, and you really can't go off the beaten path at all, despite best efforts. If you ask her after dinner, she might tell you some great stories. And it's very difficult to get a visa for North Korea, especially if you're a U.S. citizen. But it's not just getting there. It's not like the Woody Allen rule: 80% of life is showing up. You can get to North Korea, but in a way, being in North Korea when you're usually in Pyongyang, Pyongyang, as she's dubbed it, can be very deceptive, because everything is designed to make you believe that it's shiny and going well and everybody loves the leadership. And what Anna has done, and really sort of perfected some of the techniques that I started, was talking to defectors, matching what you see on the inside from what you see on the outside. And that, in some ways, has gotten much harder over the years. I covered North Korea pretty much full-time from 2001 to 2006, and then over the next 7 years when I was living in Beijing. And for most of those years, you could still go to Yenji or Tumen, which are Chinese cities near the North Korean border, and find defectors. I mean, you needed a guide and, talk to them. Now, because of increased Chinese and North Korean controls, it's really, really hard to reach those people. And that's why I think Anna's report, especially last year in 2017 in the Washington Post, about what North Koreans were thinking was just an eye-opener. It was so revealing. And North Koreans are great, for journalists, North Koreans are great interviewees. They're very precise, they're quite articulate, although they don't really like us. The first word you might hear from them is 미국놈. I think some of you understand that. It means American bastard, and that's what we are. But they get over that really quickly and talk to us. And their stories are heartbreaking. They're really heartbreaking. And I've met so many North Koreans who, when you meet them and they're freshly defected, they're still loyal to the regime, and they talk about our nation, Urinara. But within, 20 minutes of speaking, they'll just, have tears in their eyes, talking about their children and their elderly parents. And, almost every North Korean you meet has had something horrible happen to them, something really horrible. And, they'll start out saying, well, nothing ever special happened to me. I wasn't in the gulag, I wasn't in a prison camp, but then it turns out, their 4-year-old son was next to them in bed, and they woke up and the kid was dead. There was an amazing report from Human Rights Watch that came out recently about how many women have been sexually abused, and this is not like harassment. This is, you come with me. It's really tough to be a North Korean, and I think, those of us who've worked with North Koreans, are hoping that part of this diplomatic process will not just look at nuclear weapons and missiles, but also the situation for the North Korean people. And, in a way, it's the Trump administration seems to feel that they don't want human rights to get in the way. But I think that's a mistake because, we can't really normalize relations with this country in any way unless there's some change. And so, I hope we keep on pushing on that. And I don't know, I think, the guest to my left can talk more about, what's happening recently. I have more or less, I don't know, this is speeding back, I more or less moved on in 2014. So my information about what's going on in North Korea, regrettably, is not as much up to date as I'd like. But, I hope Anna continues reporting, that she's not too distracted by that other country to the west of North Korea.
West Korea.
West Korea that has a bit going on. But anyway, I'm so happy that you've won this award, and I'm so happy to read what you write.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, I am also extremely pleased to be here to celebrate this award with and for Anna. I've been involved for many years with an organization called Joseon Exchange, a Singaporean nonprofit that trains North Koreans in economic policy and entrepreneurship, trying to feed into some of the positive changes that have taken place, particularly under Kim Jong-un, that Anna mentioned in her talk. So we've trained officials in things like agricultural finance and special economic zone management. We've done trainings on public-private partnerships and foreign exchange management issues, bedrock issues that officials and academics there need to understand. We've also trained entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs, helping teach them how to start and grow companies in a way that is positive and, importantly, I think, productive. And that is a key change that has taken place under Kim Jong-un. Anna mentioned that Kim has coddled particularly this upper middle and upper class in Pyongyang. But the old way of doing that under Kim Jong-il and his father, Kim Il-sung, was very much through a loyalty and gift economy. Money was not necessary in the old North Korea. And now, it is. You do need to get your daily necessities, and if you're lucky enough, your products that help you have a more pleasurable life through the markets. And so what these classes are most interested in are opportunities to make money. So you see young people in North Korea, and the old pathways to success through the bureaucracy in the party or through the military rising through the ranks are less attractive now than ever. The most attractive career is one in business, one that provides you, especially with access to the outside world, because there is more money in the outside world. Being a diplomat is also seen as a good career because not only is it prestigious, but it also gets you access to the outside world. So I met Anna because of this work with Joseon Exchange. My colleague Jeffrey in 2014 said to me, Anna Fifield of the Washington Post is interested in covering some of what we do, but what we do is quite sensitive. How you run the economy in North Korea is an extremely touchy issue. They never use the word reform, for example. You can use any euphemism you like with a North Korean in discussing their economy, but not that word. And there are all sorts of rhetorical minefields that you have to wander through. But so Jeffrey said to me, my colleague, he said, so she's in Seoul this week. Why don't you meet with her and see if you think she's someone we could work with, who can, understand the sensitivities that we have to deal with on this issue. And I said, okay, I'm going to go do it. I'm going to put on my suspicious cap. Journalists, they're not looking out for us. They're looking out for themselves, always fighting for the next scoop. And so I met her at the Starbucks across from the Westin Chosun. We sat down. And literally within 2 or 3 minutes, I was saying, like, oh, you're going to love it when you come, and when you're gonna learn so much. It's such an interesting group of people, blah, blah, blah. And it was only afterwards, when I left, that I was like, how'd she do that? And I had read some of her work before and understood that she had some analytical chops, but it was only at that moment that I was like, this is a special journalist. She's got something. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here today. In that regard, I mean, both of these women are special journalists. I'd just like to mention a couple of the things that they have to overcome in order to provide us with stories about North Korea. They've both talked about how difficult it is. Kim Jong-il in the mid-1990s is reported to have said, we must wrap Korea in a fog. Our politics must be hidden from the outside world. And they do a tremendous job at that. So the North Koreans make it more difficult than any other place in the world. But then we on the outside also provide tremendous pressures as well. Part of that is because there is so little information about North Korea. Journalists have to rely on official sources so much. And the range of opinions within officialdom in the United States has been on North Korea very small. And that limits the sort of stories that are possible. Now, Donald Trump has come along and fractured both the media, or opened up fissures in both the media and in officialdom. So a lot of that is in flux. And there's been an important story just this week that I think illustrates how tumultuous and fractured that the media and official landscape has become. Check out a story by David Sanger in the New York Times based on a CSIS report this week if you're interested. And then a big part of the problem is also due to us, the audiences. In a click-driven world, and with literally a whole world of news, North Korea can only occupy our attention so much, unless you're like me and occupies every day. A general audience really only pays attention to North Korea on 3 topics. 1, when they do something scary, like a nuclear test or a missile test. 2, when there's something particularly cruel or unpleasant. And then, of course, when they do something particularly weird or quirky, as they are prone to do. So, the unicorns. A few years ago, they said they mistranslated discovering a unicorn lair. Well, that was a news story for a couple of days. Or everybody has to get Kim Jong-un's haircut. That was a news story for a few days. Also not true. But there's also a tremendous sort of pull pressure from the audience on journalists as well. So all these things, these two and a handful of other good journalists have to fight against on a daily basis to provide us with accurate and nuanced reporting on North Korea. So I'm very pleased to be here to commend the job that Anna and also Barbara have done in that regard. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you in joining me for Barbara and Andre's remarks. Can you hear me? Okay. So now we would like to open up the discussion. So we'll have a Q&A session, but before we actually open up to the floor, I actually have several questions of my own. So I'll ask those to our panelists. In the meantime, you guys can think about your own questions, and we'll have plenty of time for that. Just one thing to note is that we have a very hard stop at 1:30 because there's an event afterwards. So I'll be pretty strict at ending at 1:30. So one thing that I really appreciate, all three of you, is that you actually go and speak to North Koreans, get insights, and infer based on what we can learn from that. So my own research on North Korea is very different. I do it from a very, very far distance, literally. I do it from space using satellite images. So I have no understanding of what's happening on the ground to these people. But one of the most interesting things that's happening right now is North Korea and U.S. relationships. Somehow they are talking, but as Barbara mentioned, there's this term they refer to, 미국 놈, which is a derogatory term for American, but it's a very actually, in less severe way. They use much more severe words in actuality. And what happens, they're brainwashed from since I don't know how young, but when they're in elementary school, that your enemies are the Americans. You send missiles to blow them away. They have probably seen all these propaganda posters of blowing up Americans. So if you grow up in that mentality, right, and then suddenly there's a shift in momentum of the two countries are talking to each other. Their leader, Kim Jong-un, is actually speaking with Trump. So I know you probably haven't been able to ask that right now, but how do you think, based on your experience with North Koreans, that they are processing this? How do you think people are processing this? How are they accepting this, or do you think they feel deceived, or do you think they believe that this is the right direction? If any insight on that, I would really appreciate. I'm just dumbfounded.
I'd start that.
Yeah, please do.
I mean, my sense is that when you have a foreign politician meeting with a North Korean, when you have foreign aid coming to North Korea, that's spun as paying tribute to the North Korean system. So I think they would see Donald Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un as, look, he's come to Asia to, meet with us. I've also gotten the sense talking to I don't know why I'm feeding back so much, but I've gotten the sense talking to North Koreans personally that their hatred for the U.S. is a bit official, and they believe it. But at least talking to border crossers, I found that they really dislike the Chinese, and everything that they say officially, we're allied with the Chinese, but you Americans are the enemy, is kind of like the opposite. And I think even the people in the leadership have this sense that China is just bigger and closer, and over the long term maybe more of a threat than the U.S. And I've heard it said many times that the nuclear program has been a way of taking control of their own self-defense, not needing to outsource their security needs to China, expecting Chinese troops to come crossing the Yalu, in their defense. But as is among ordinary people, I've found the dislike for the Chinese to run very deep, and I've also found them, pretty friendly to me.
Yeah, I would just say I think that Kim Jong-un will be able to spin this as saying, when the regime will say, look, Kim Jong-un is such a powerful and internationally respected leader that Xi Jinping is hosting him on the red carpet in Beijing, that Donald Trump flew all the way to Asia, as you say. So they can really propagandize this to say that this is a sign of Kim Jong-un's legitimacy to be the leader of North Korea, that he has managed to do something that neither his father nor his grandfather did. And his grandfather did want better relations with the United States. So this all feeds into this brilliant comrade, glorious propaganda system. Whether or not the North Koreans believe it is a different story. But, that's the good thing about propaganda, I guess. You can, make the narrative, and that's what they are going to be trying to do.
I think North Koreans live with a lot of different things in their heads. We all live with some kind of cognitive dissonance, but in North Korea, I think it's quite acute. And I think it's important, it's incumbent upon us to support the growing business community in North Korea and hopefully find a breakthrough in the near future that allows them to be less isolated from the world for a couple of reasons. First, North Korea does a pretty fantastic job of isolating its own people. And when we do that as well, that creates a real sort of pressure cooker, I think, domestically. But also, business people are like business people anywhere. They are not interested in politics insofar as they just want it out of the way. So they're not interested in the nuclear program per se. They're interested in having the opportunity to make money. So what I heard is when Trump said, I'll meet with him, immediately that rumor rocketed around Pyongyang, especially the business community, and people were, I think, perhaps irrationally exuberant about the possibilities. We can get rid of sanctions. We'll trade with the U.S. and with Japan and with everybody. A brave new world, bold new day is coming. And now I think, like a lot of us in Pyongyang, people are like, well, is this really going anywhere? Why is this taking so long? Is this going to fall apart?
Well, thank you. So my other question, I have a few more. It also relates to, especially Anna's. I really appreciate your interviews that you did with these people, and because a lot of the coverage on North Korea is often focused in Pyongyang, as you mentioned, Pyongyang, and they seem to be doing pretty well. They're the elites that Kim Jong-un is catering to. That solidifies his power. But you mentioned that people in the hinterlands, they are living in dire poverty, subsistence entrepreneurs, basically trying to make ends meet. So in that situation, how much of an information dissonance exists such that those living in the hinterlands, are they thinking, could they be feel any for instance, could they be thinking about any revolts, for instance, because due to rising inequality? And has there been any revolts in North Korea or any indications of that from among these people living in more rural areas, non-Pyongyang elites? So I was curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen no signs at all of any revolution or cracks in the system at all. I think the regime has kept very tight control of people. So, I mean, there may have been, some dissent, but we have not heard about it. And I'm sure that those people did not stick around for long after. In terms of disparities, it kind of depends on where the hinterlands are. Like, I think if you're in Wonsan or somewhere kind of on the east coast, you're relatively isolated. As opposed to people who live in Hesan, Haeryong, people on the border with China. Those people actually feel sorry for people who live in Pyongyang because they don't have that easy access to China. They have kind of more control because it is the capital. But the people who live on the border, They have Chinese cell phones. They can pick up signals from Chinese cell phone towers across the river. They can bribe their way back and forth across if it's for kind of economic activity, for trading and things, not for escape. They can, they're much more open to the outside world. And so I think those people have flourished. But even within North Korea, there is now much more freedom of movement, and many supposedly state-owned cars and trucks and buses have been leased out to private entrepreneurs. So you can take an intercity minibus in North Korea now. You can send stuff on a servicha, the little trucks and things that go around the country. So information is coming in over the border more and more, and it is percolating around North Korea more and more. But what I had heard from all of the North Koreans I interviewed last year was just this: it is still so dangerous to raise your eyebrows at the system, even that the punishment is so severe. And if, say, you question, like, is it really right for Kim Jong-un to be putting all of this money into the nuclear program instead of, for example, feeding us or improving daily life? That will get not just you sent to the gulags in the mountains, but your parents and your children as well. It's this 3-generation, getting rid of this, the guilt by association system, which still reigns in North Korea today. So that is why people say they try to escape rather than trying to bring about change in North Korea.
Mm-hmm. What else? Okay, thank you.
She's got it.
Yeah. So just piggyback on that. Do you think people now can move from the rural hinterlands to, if they want, to the Chinese border to seek a better life?
Yeah, I mean, people say they can bribe their way. I mean, generally they're still assigned houses and residences by the state, but it seems like there are many ways you can bribe your way through the system. I don't know whether you could actually move there, but you could certainly travel there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think that exposure to China is important too, because when North Koreans aspire for something else, it's sort of like a Chinese dream in a way, to borrow an expression. I don't think most people are dreaming of a Jeffersonian democracy or anything like that, but they see the opportunity that the Chinese model allows, and they have so much exposure to China in Pyongyang as well, but especially on the border. I think that's what people dream of a lot.
Okay. So another question, and this could be more general, is that so we believe information can change societies, right? If we're supposedly able to provide more information to North Koreans, we potentially believe that the society can change. But how do you get information from the outside into North Korea in such a country, in such a highly censored country? And how is North Korea more challenging based on your experiences compared to places like Iran, Myanmar, other highly censored regimes? And what do you think would be a best way to get information into North Korea?
I could say not floating balloons over the DMZ.
Okay.
Which, I mean, there's been all sorts of, crazy ideas by human rights activists, putting messages on balloons, smuggling in telephones.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's you've got to feel sorry in a way for the North Korean regime, because it's really hard to be an absolutist dictatorship in 2018, in this globalized world. And, they have really, the North Korean government has really struggled. How do they build their economy? How do they keep their scientists educated, their doctors educated, while keeping out information that they don't, that threatens the stability of the regime. And there's a lot of propaganda in North Korea, especially directed at people living in the border. Do not follow these Western dreams, these false idols, and because they know any glimpse of the outside world is very corrosive to the regime's stability. And I've said this so many times, but I'll repeat it, is the most destructive thing for North Korea is when people watch South Korean soap operas and they see a South Korean bus driver in his kitchen, and they see the microwave and the rice cooker and the flat screen TV and the smartphones, and like it's any of that is very corrosive.
Yeah. I mean, of all the 25 North Koreans that I interviewed last year, escapees from North Korea, every single one of them had watched foreign media. They had watched South Korean dramas and Chinese films, Indian films, everything. So everybody in North Korea now pretty much has an idea, I think, that the outside world is a much richer and freer place. And they said the same things that people I talked to said they wanted to see the clothes that they're wearing. And if South Korea is so poor, like we're told, why does this woman have her own car? In North Korea, there's no private car ownership. So this kind of thing is very illuminating to them. And I think now everybody pretty much knows. But the question is, why has nothing changed if that is the case? Why has there been no agitation for more freedom in North Korea? And I think this goes back to the system of repression, where it is still so strong that even if you know it's a lie, you still have to go along with it.
Yeah, I mean, there are subversive ways to get information in, but I also think it's important to try to encourage the North Koreans to allow more in officially, which is, I guess, part of the work that I've been involved with. Same with, for example, the joint bid for the Olympics in 2032 that the North Koreans and South Koreans are discussing together. What a great idea! If the North Koreans are really serious about doing that would necessitate a change in how they allow information and people in. But let's see if they're willing to take steps in that direction. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Great points. So now I'd like to open up to the floor. So when you do ask questions, please do introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and we'll have mics going around. So please do wait for the mic to come to you. Okay. So we have a lot of hands, but first I promised this lady up front.
Thank you very much for everything that you said so far. My name is Christine Wallace, and I'm just a member of the community. I was wondering if I could get comments from Wall on the status of the relationship between North and South Korea, and in particular on the sort of initiatives with Moon Jae-in, and how you think that's going, what you think the prospects are for that contributing to some kind of progress on the peninsula, something other than unification at the end of a bayonet.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's really extraordinary, the change that we've seen this year under Moon Jae-in and how he has precipitated all of this. And he saw the opportunity with the Olympics to become the trigger for this broader process. And he is really trying to go full speed ahead with economic engagement and building some of the infrastructure that North Korea so badly needs. The question there is how much they can do without breaching sanctions, which is pretty much nothing at all. There's still South Korean sanctions in place against North Korea, which they could get rid of, but they would still run afoul of the UN sanctions if they invested or sent anything, pretty much anything to North Korea other than oranges. So that is beholden to the broader international American run process, I think. But I think a lot of South Koreans feel much more comfortable when this engagement process is going on. They feel that the risk of anything happening is lower, and there has traditionally been a lot of support for that. The difference in South Korean opinion is very much a generational issue, and that older South Koreans who may have memories of the war or memories of stories of the war feel much closer to North Koreans and North Korea than younger generations of people who look at North Koreans as these kind of country bumpkins who don't know how to pay for a latte on their smartphone, this kind of thing. And they don't feel that same sense of familial, obligation to the North Koreans in the same way. So for them, I mean, they probably support this engagement process because it makes unification less likely. It's more likely to bring up North Korea from within and to keep it intact and not be a burden on the South.
Yeah,
I would just mention that this is not entirely new. I mean, when Anna and I started covering the Koreas out of Seoul, it was, during the whole sunshine policy, the so-called sunshine policy, launched by Kim Dae-jung, then by No Mu-yeon, and a lot of these joint delegations and these railroads across the DMZ and the industrial parks. I mean, we've seen this before, so we're kind of going back to the situation that was in the early 2000s.
So I'll have those over there. Trying to hit different parts of the group. So that gentleman. So we'll have both of them have.
My name is Adam Bernstein. I'm actually a colleague of yours, Anna, although I have not met you yet.
Yeah, hi, Adam.
Thanks for showing up and doing this. My question is about the war. We're still technically at war with North Korea. What's your sense of, for everybody there, the prospects for finally coming to an end to the war officially, and how much of is that a barrier toward the progress?
Okay.
And please go ahead, and we can answer both.
My name is E.Y. Park. I'm a visiting scholar at the Asia Pacific Research Center. My question is about the human rights and the market. Many of the North Korean defectors who reside in Korea actually testify that they had a difficulty of understanding several concepts of the human rights, such as liberty, freedom, or a human rights, because they've never heard of those kind of word in North Korea, firstly. Secondly, even though they understand conceptually what it is, but they never experienced it. So many of them testify that it took almost 3 to 4 years for them to really capture what the independence or freedom or the human rights be in their personal life. So my question is about the interpretation of the impact of the market. You mentioned that the people have a rising expectation, so that if they lived in a really miserable condition, they may never experienced someone as a person to be treated as a human being. But if their living standard is rising, then they may have a little more resistance to be a human rights violation. So my question is whether the rising expectations or the rise of the human living standard would naturally result in the people's awareness of a person to be treated as just a minimum human standard, or because of the tight control of the system, as you mentioned, the kind of punishment and so forth. So unless and until there's outside impact to break in the system, never achieved the level of the human rights in North Korea. How do you interpret that? Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the end of the war, I think, we have seen surprising progress on that, I think, because maybe Donald Trump didn't quite understand all of the factors at play when he agreed with Kim Jong-chol in Washington to work towards the end of war agreement. But I think it's high time that war was ended, right? The peace agreement should be signed. The question is just on what terms. And traditionally, North Korea has insisted that it involves the end of military exercises between the South Korea and the United States, but also the withdrawal of American troops from South Korea. And that has been a deal breaker for the US all this time, right? But now, Donald Trump has been willing to cancel the exercises, apparently with no notice to any allies in the region, just to scrap those. And, even before all this happened, he was talking about pulling troops out of, why are we paying to defend these rich countries? So I think the system is in place, and some, people with more experience in military matters than him may prevail upon him with that. But I think they could find a way to work towards that. And that is something that North Korea really desperately wants. In terms of human rights and words like liberty and things, North Koreans have no concept of these things because they've never experienced it. And for example, if I had talked to somebody who'd been in a kwaliso, in a gulag system, and if I said to them, have you ever been tortured? They would say no. And then if I would say something like, did they ever force you to sit down like cross-legged or in one position for a time? And they'll be like, oh yeah, I had to sit cross-legged with my hands behind my back for 12 hours a day and things. It's the words that they don't have for it, or they don't think about this as torture. They think about this as the kind of treatment that you get in North Korea. So I think a lot of it is kind of conceptual or linguistic in a way. On human rights, I think, for years and years, decades, North Korea refused to acknowledge any human rights abuses, refused to acknowledge the existence of the camps or anything like that. But we saw a surprising change in 2014 with the UN Commission of Inquiry report, which blamed the leader personally for the system and recommended that Kim Jong-un be referred to the International Criminal Court to face charges of crimes against humanity. And we have no evidence to suggest this has led to any improvement in North Korea itself, but we have seen the North Koreans sit up and engage on human rights in a way that they never have before, to answer questions in some ways. I mean, of course, they're defensive. They put out their own report of American human rights abuses. But the fact that they are responding and things does count for slight progress in that area. And we were talking earlier that there has been some progress in terms of disabilities, the treatment of disabled people in North Korea that Kathy Zellweger documented when she was here at Stanford. So we have reason to think that outside pressure can help a little bit, not anywhere near as much as it needs to, but at least to start the process.
There has to be that mix between pressure and engagement. And I do think the North Koreans have been forced to think more about human rights because of some of the reportage that has happened. I do think that naming Kim Jong-un was a tactical mistake. But the engagement side is important too, because the progress on disabilities in North Korea in the last 5 years has been tremendous, and that's through the work of NGOs. And I think there are other issues that possibly we could target for cooperation. Just last week, you referenced the Human Rights Watch report on sexual abuse in North Korea and women's rights. And I think that is another issue that we could probably cooperate positively on with the North Koreans, something I'm thinking about. A lot of the other stuff is at the heart of their political system and their justice system, such as it is. But there are issues that I think we could stand to cooperate more with on human rights.
If I just would add briefly on human rights, I think one way that the rising living of standard can have a better conception or demand for human rights is through property rights. So as living standard increases, they at least know which goods are mine, whether I own this good or not, or this portion of land. And when that's sort of taken away by force, then they realize that's a very easy concept, that I have a property right. If that's taken away from me, that's a violation of my right. And that sort of is I think that happens a lot in very low income countries, that this perception of property rights sort of come first and then human rights follows. So I'll try to get some questions from the back. The gentleman with the unique hair. It's purple if you're looking back.
My name is Ben Villar. I'm a first-year master's student here at Stanford Center for East Asian Studies. I'm particularly interested in Zainichi Korean studies, and my question is kind of in regards to the Korean language and culture schools that are in Japan that are funded by the North Korean government. And I was just wondering on what maybe your insights are for the political justification or legitimization and reasoning behind why they would continue to send any funding at all to these this diaspora community that is in Japan, and kind of what if this is seen as a benefit to them, or why do they continue to keep this going?
You mean, why does North Korea? North Korea doesn't send money to these schools, as far as I am aware. I mean, so there are these North Korean schools in Japan, run by Japanese Koreans, North Koreans, that they have really diminished in size over the past few years, and they've faced a lot more constraints. So, Yeah, they're much smaller than they used to be. And over the past few years, the Japanese government has really cracked down on the forms of funding. Things the Chosen Soren movement in Japan is now much smaller than it used to be. Japanese government confiscated their building, and there have been a number of raids on the leadership of the Chosen Soren. So I think that has become a much more fringe, much smaller part of the Zainichi community in Japan. Even in the 4 years that I lived there, it really diminished a lot.
Yeah. But they helped them so much in the 50s,
Yeah,
60s, and
in the
70s.
beginning, yeah, it
And
was
that's,
much.
yeah.
Yeah.
I interviewed a couple for a book I'm working on recently, and they said, yeah, the South Koreans gave us nothing, but the North Koreans helped us tremendously at a time where we couldn't get jobs, couldn't get education. And so that created a well of support, which has withered since the abduction issue. And young, third generation kids who, like in the South Korea, don't feel connected really to this weird socialist state.
Okay, I think we have one more question. The gentleman with the blue shirt. Yep, right over there. Yep.
Hi, my name's Drew, and I'm a member of the community. I have a question about reporting on North Korea, which I hope you guys can answer, which is, it seems that the flow of information comes from defectors, sort of at one level, and then like satellite imagery and everything from another level. And how do you guys have to vet or be careful about these types of stories that were mentioned, the unicorn, or ones with oddly specific details like the assassination of somebody by anti-tank missiles? It's like, how do you guys sort of vet stories? And also, like, I also wanted to, the second part of the question is, how do those type of sensational stories play into our narrative and our stereotypes, and sort of play into this idea of the North Korean regime being mysterious, potentially violent, whether it's true or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we have struggled with kind of almost on a daily basis. And that a lot of the information, particularly about purges and executions, comes from the South Korean National Intelligence Service, which then briefs lawmakers in South Korea, which then go and tell South Korean media, which we then read. So it's like a very fourth-hand process. But the South Korean Intelligence Service is always killing off people who then show up a few months later, at a potato farm visit or something or other. So I am very, very skeptical of, or treat very carefully, those kind of reports. And I would err on the side of not writing a story until we have better proof. In some situations, the North Korean regime, KCNA will come out and say that somebody has been relieved of their position. With Jang Song-taek, we saw that happen very theatrically, and that he was removed and then brought back to be removed again, or played out on TV. So in that kind of situation, yes, of course, we can report what we are seeing. Usually then I would say according to the North Korean narrative, or this could not be independently verified. But even then, only if it passes the kind of gut check feeling of it. With North Korean defectors, this has become a real problem, especially since I first started writing about North Korea, in that now it's basically an industry in South Korea. You can be a professional North Korean escapee. There's all these, television shows that they're on talking about their life in North Korea, and it's all paid. They all get paid to appear, and often scripted and things. And this, even when we were there, living there, you would find Japanese media would pay South Korean defectors for their testimony, but now it's just kind of standard. They expect to be paid, which obviously, as American serious media, we do not pay anybody anywhere in the world. So for me, in terms of the people that I interviewed last year, it was all through human rights groups or groups that were helping the North Koreans settle into life in South Korea. I would ask them if they could introduce me to people, and 8 times out of 10, the person would say, yes, I'll pay you, and it's $300 an hour. I'll talk to you, and it's $300 an hour, at which point I would then, of course, say, I'm sorry, thank you. But some people, 2 of the people would agree to talk for free, and those are the people I would talk to. And in many ways, I understand why these people who are engineers yet have never seen a computer and cannot get a job in South Korea, why this is their one marketable skill, being North Korean. I can understand why they want to try to monetize that, but we as ethical journalists can never pay. So this has become a big problem in terms of finding people who are willing to talk. But then it does give me more certainty that if they're willing to tell their story, it's for perhaps the right reasons. If they are selling their story, there's more incentive to exaggerate it, or to, instead of saying you've just been in a, in a prison camp, to say that you've been in a total control camp or something. Like, the more sensational your story is, the more you can sell it for. I think so. That has become a big problem for people like us working in South Korea these days. And also part of the reason I've tried to see people in China and Laos and Thailand when they're coming out, because their information is a lot fresher and more relevant, but also they haven't then been sucked into this South Korean industry.
Okay, I think that's a terrific place to end this talk. So please join me in congratulating Anna Fifield once more, and thanking Anna, Barbara, and Andre in their contribution in providing information about North Korea and continuing their coverage and research and travels. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan.